Welcome to Clearwater Jazz Holidays, Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. Today's educator and guest musician is Brandon Robertson, and his topic is how to develop melodic bass lines. Participants are muted, but if you have questions, please use the chat feature and we'll get those questions to Brandon. You could also use the raise your hand feature and we'll make that happen as well. If you have feedback for any of these sessions that we are doing, please email your feedback to info@clearwaterjazz.com. You can check out all of the upcoming sessions at clearwaterjazz.com/education. A lot of great musicians working with us on this free program as part of our outreach initiatives supported by the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation. Brandon Robertson is an Emmy-nominated music director, professional upright electric bassist, composer, and music educator, originally from Tampa, Florida. He completed his Bachelor of Arts in Music from Florida State University and a Master of Music and Jazz Studies in the spring of 2016. Currently, Brandon is the Director of Jazz Studies and Director of the Florida Gulf Coast University Basketball Band at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers. He is an honorary member of the Kappa Kappa Psi Mu Upsilon chapter at Florida Gulf Coast University. In 2018, Brandon was nominated for an Emmy Award for Best Documentary for Educational Collegiate Programs, featuring the Florida Gulf Coast University Jazz Ensemble. As a prominent band leader, Brandon has taken his band on multiple national tours, headlining at some of the top jazz venues in the country. To add to his very impressive resume, Brandon has performed with notable acts such as the world-famous Count Basie Orchestra, led by director Scotty Barnhart, vocalist Carmen Bradford, Jason Marsalis, Marcus Roberts, Marty Morell, a good friend of ours, and many more. We're so fortunate to have Brandon with us. He has been featured as a performer and a band leader at various national jazz festivals. And if you are interested in getting in touch with Brandon, you can do so via social media or his email, brandonrobertsonmusic@gmail.com. Brandon, we're so happy to have you back with us. Very excited. I'm going to turn it over for you. The stage is all yours, my friend.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you to the entire foundation from the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation. You guys are amazing. I had a great time with my last session. Talking about the development of professional musicians and how do you develop your career. But today, we're actually going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is how do you create melodic bass lines? And obviously, me being a bass player, one of my foundations, the purest foundation of being a strong bass player is understanding how bass lines work and how those notes and the note selections that you choose all fit into the context of the music. Right now, I believe that my Spotify playlist is already up on the website in the clearwaterjazz.com/education page. And if you go directly to my session for today, there's a Spotify link on there that have all of my recommended recordings. And I'm actually going to talk about some of the bass players that are on those records. So to start off, how do you create a bass line? And fundamentally, we're dealing with scales. When you're performing with bass lines, or when you're creating your own bass lines, you're basically deriving those notes from a pattern of scales. And for me, it's all about the root. So you have to understand that the root motion of the bass, it systematically helps keep the foundation intact with the rest of the band, particularly for the soloist, because whoever is soloing at the time, whichever, if it's a horn or a guitarist or a pianist, essentially they are relying on the bass to provide the bottom, what we call the bottom foundation, the harmonical palette. The key thing is to making sure that when you're creating a walking bass line, that you always provide the root at the beginning of each measure. That root motion really solidifies the staple of the chord. Okay, so for instance, if we're in the key of F, if we're playing like a F blues, if I want the first chorus of me walking a F blues, I might hit the root on every single downbeat, just so that the soloist understands the form and they understand harmonically where it's going. I try to tell my younger students to always start off with the roots. And so my younger bass students, I usually have them play the root and the fifth of each chord. And we're starting off with a blues. I have them do that so they can hear how it moves, they can hear that root motion, and it also gives the foundation of the form itself. And as we go through different sections, you might have an AABA section or et cetera, or in this case, 12 measures, where you have 4 measures of just one chord. You have another 2 measures of the 4 chord. You can either go back to the 1, and then the last 4 you split between the minor 2, the dominant 5, and you're back to the 1. And so I might be speaking musical terms here, but in the bass relation, playing those roots really helps hear where harmonically you're going. And then as you start to advance and you start learning more about how bass lines work, then you start venturing into different modes. You start expanding upon the scale itself. So if I'm dealing with a Mixolydian scale, if for a bass player, it would be the note head and then the 7th. So we're talking about a dominant 7th chord, which would be the 1, the 5, a 1, the 3rd, the 5th, and then the flat 7. And so we're dealing with that context. And so I usually tell them you have 4 notes that you can start with. You have the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and that 7th. But if you're just trying to outline a clear basis of what you're doing, playing those triads, playing those arpeggios in your bass lines will help hear what's going on. And so I always start off my students with just playing the roots and the 5th. And once I can see that they can go through a 12-bar blues with the roots and the 5th, then I'll have them add in the 3rd. Now, to a bass player, the 3rd actually is going to dictate the quality of that chord. We're not talking about the 7ths yet. We're talking just about the triad, the root, the 3rd, and the 5th. When you add the 3rd in there, if it's a major 3rd, then you know you have more of a major triad. If you add a minor 3rd, you have a minor triad. But the 7th also determines the extension quality of that chord. So we're dealing with, again, I started with talking about an F blues. If I played an F7, I'm playing an F, an A natural, a C natural, and an E flat, okay? So what that does is now I understand that when I'm walking, if I play a major 3rd, but I play that flat 7, now I'm creating a dominant type of sound, okay? And the same goes for if I change that 3rd to a minor 3rd, but I keep that flat 7, now I have a minor dominant chord. So for bass, I always teach my students to know the difference between the major 7th and a flat 7th and a minor 3rd and a major 3rd, because that 3rd determines the quality. When you hear a piano player play their chords, most of the time they're voicing that 3rd, they're voicing that 5th and an upper extension. The bass player is usually playing the root, because the pianist does not have to fill in all of that space. That's what the bass player's job is to do. So I time to time, when I listen to young bass players perform, I would hear them not hit the root on the downbeat. And it throws the piano player off, because they're like, well, I need that bottom. I need that first note at the bottom. And if you don't have that, then what happens is it will change the sound of what's going on. So if you're playing a blues, and let's say the first 4 measures, I'm playing F7. When I get to that 4 chord, if I don't hit the B flat on beat 1 of that chord, then it could cause some kind of confusion. Almost, it'll almost come across like you're wrong, which some degree, which is not, and to some degree, that's not the case, because you could be playing a bass line that's extending beyond just the root motion, which I'll get into that in a second. But primarily, first and foremost, you want to lay down the root motion. That root motion is super, super important. Okay. Which would lead me to my first example. On my Spotify playlist, this album is, we weren't able to find this album on Spotify, but if you type in Leroy Vinegar, he was a prominent bassist, probably one of my favorite bass players out of the 50s. And he came out with an album, I think it was in 57 or 50, it's between 57 and 59. I might be a little rusty on the time frame, but I know it was in the late 50s, and it's entitled Leroy Walks. Then he did another one called Leroy Walks Again. And the entire album, he walks. He doesn't solo. He doesn't take any kind of flat. He's just walking. Every solo he took on that record, he's just playing a walking bass line. And what I admire about that particular record is how he was able to fundamentally figure out how to play the most melodic content without steering away from the root foundation of the bass. That was one of my first introductories to learning how to play a constructive bass line without having to step away from doing all the fancy stuff that us bass players like to do. One of my favorite songs off of that album is On the Sunny Side of the Street. And Tony Baisley, I believe is, Tony Baisley, I think, is the drummer on that record. Leroy, and when it gets to his part of the song when he's walking, you can distinctively hear him playing the melody of the song, but he's still hitting the root motions on each measure. That is something that I could never figure out how he was doing that, because it sounds very melodic, but really he's playing very simplistic. 1, 2, 3, 5. He might resolve the next measure on the third interval of that chord, but he's extending his bass lines. So what I've learned as a bass player, and what I've been taught by the great bass players, is when you're creating a bass line, you need to create tension. There's tension and release in jazz. And if your bass lines have an arc and it's supposed to go somewhere, like a roller coaster, you go all the way up to the top. And once you reach that peak, it's supposed to come back down. It has to resolve. It has to come. You have to come back and go back down the slope. The same thing with your bass lines. When you're dealing with when you're doing a walking line, and I use that song in particular, and I want for my listeners and people who are going to be watching this later, go back and listen to that particular song, because you can hear how every measure he will resolve either on the third or the flat seventh of that chord, but somehow his bass line is creating a tension. So when he gets to the bridge, he releases it back to the tonic of the bridge, and then he plays on from there, and he's walking the entire time. And that is a very interesting concept, because on the bandstand, I've had this experience where I would just be playing all over the place because I'm kind of playing what I'm hearing. And whoever's soloing will look back on me and they'll give me like a look like play the root or play or what we call a diatonic note within the chord. And so that diatonic note will actually indicate the quality of what the chord is going to be presented through your bass line. So that's very important. And I love Leroy Vinegar's album because every song on there, he does that very well. He really showcases how you're supposed to walk and create this tension, but then release. And you don't have to be flashy. A lot of the songs on that album, he's playing very minimalistically. He's playing very simple. You know, it almost sounds as though it's kind of like and I say this very respectfully, not to disrespect him, but, you know, a very elementary step-like approach, but it's very hip how he does it. And Marcus Roberts, one of the greatest J Master, one of the greatest on the piano of our generation, taught me something in school that forever stuck with me. Simple is better. And that also applies to bass. Sometimes you playing simple, it actually is creating a musical palette for the soloist to really dive into what they need to get into, because we're not taking up a lot of space harmonically and we're leaving room for the soloist to grow. And sometimes you just laying it down, we use that term, laying it down. What that means is not playing a lot of flashy stuff. You just laying down the fundamental root motion of what you're supposed to do on bass, and that actually makes the band feel good. So that's why I use that example of that album, Leroy Walks, because he just lays it down the entire time. He's not doing nothing flashy. He's not doing anything to make himself stand out, even though he's the band leader. He took that approach as, yes, I'm the band leader, but I'm also going to just hold it down. So that would be my first approach to younger bass players. When you're creating a bass line, you want to play something very simple. So I'm going to take a quick second. I'm going to pick my bass up, and I'm going to demonstrate what I mean by that. So if you guys can't hear me, I won't speak again until I sit back down, but then that way you understand. So what I'm going to do is start off with an F blues, and I'm just going to play very, very simple and just showcase that example. Give me 1 second here. Okay. Okay. Can everybody hear that? Okay. So I'm going to stand back a little bit so my face is still in the viewing of the camera. So I'm going to start off with an F blues, and I'm going to play very, very simple, what I was demonstrating. So what I was talking about earlier was the example of just playing the roots in the fifth, so you can just get a foundation of how everything is supposed to move. So that's very simple. That is like when you're teaching a beginner bass player who's never played a bass line and don't know where to start. And so I always teach them the root in the fifth because of the position on the bass. It's much easier for them to play that 1-5 diagonal versus adding in the third. So then I tell my students, we're going to add in the third. We're going to add in the third scale degree. Okay, so now we're adding another note. And when you start off simple like that, you're giving your student a palette to think about, because if they've never played a bass line before, they're having to think about what they're playing. So if you just teach them very simply, just use the 3 notes in the chord, the root, the third, and the fifth. So I'll have them do something like this. Just do simply just that, okay? Now, when you add in the 7th scale degree with that flat 7, now you have 4 notes. So now you're filling in the 4 beats in the measure. Now they have something that they can work with. So they don't, if you're teaching them already about scales and they can already play scales, or you can already play scales, then you already know how to separate the root, the third, the fifth, and now you're adding in that flat 7. And usually, and always remember that on a dominant chord, that 7th scale degree is flat. The only way it would not be if it's indicated as a major chord. So when you see a major, you know that you have to play a major 7th. Outside of those parameters, that 7th is always going to be a lower 7th scale degree. So now we're adding in the 4th note. So everyone can hear me now? Is there clear? Okay. So that's pretty much what I do and how I go about teaching my beginner bass students. As simple and minimalistic as that is, if I can get my students to go through a 12-bar blues in that sequence, breaking it down with only using 2 notes first, then you add another note. Now you have 4 notes filling in the entire measure. So now that's building them confidence, is giving them ideas, is making them think out of the box. So then once I get past that part, we go to the next phase, which is inversions. So if I played in first inversion on bass, if I was playing an F7, I would start on A natural. If I was playing in second inversion, I would start on C, which is the 5th. And I take these concepts and I tell the students that when you're able to play in inversions, now what that does is it changes the context of your bass lines. So now, which instead of it sounding just straight root, now you're creating tension. So another example of that, I know I'm kind of going to jump back and forth here, but I'll provide another example real quick. Okay. So another example of this would be to play the inversion. So I'm going to start off by playing the first example, which I played just the root. I played on an F7. Now, if I play that 7th, I'm already set up to play the first inversion of the 4th chord, which I can play D natural. So now I've created I've created now another form and another way of playing this line without having to restrict back to the root. So if I do that throughout the whole blues, now I can change. I can intermix second and third inversion within my bass lines. So I can start off like this: root, 3rd, 5th, flat 7, 3rd, 5th, flat 7, 1, and then now I'm back to the F chord, but now I can go 3, 1, flat 7, 5, 3rd again, and I can just go back down. So now I'm giving So now what I'm doing is I'm giving my students, I'm giving them a way to hear outside of just that root motion, starting to expand upon your ear. Great recordings will help that. When you listen to a lot of great bass lines, that'll help that. So which will actually take me to my next example. One of the few, I'm gonna list a bunch of records here to you all. Actually, instead of giving you an example, I'm going to list a bunch of records to you, and I'm going to name the bass players on these records, and then I'm going to give you 2 distinctive qualifications or attributes or little contributions that each of these bass players have in their playing that makes them different. So the first record is by Thelonious Monk, Live at the It Club. Now, if no one's never heard of that record, that is probably one of the most swinging Monk records I've ever heard. Monk's music was very hard to listen to, especially as a bass player, because his bass players, all of them, all of the 3, I guess the 3 bass players that I'm familiar with that has played with Monk, they all play the same. And Monk has a very distinctive way how he likes his bass players to perform. You won't hear a lot of root motions in those bass players, in their bass lines. What you hear is a lot of tritone substitutions. You hear a lot of tension between his line, because if you listen to Monk's music, Monk uses rubs, what we like to call musical rubs, where he'll take 2 notes that are a half step apart and he will clash those notes against the chord. What I found from studying Monk's bass players is that the 2 notes that he chooses to play as a rub are either a tritone going against the chord that he's playing, which the bass player is playing either the root or that sharp 4 in their bass lines. So it's creating this tension, but melodically and harmonically, it makes sense. You won't know that unless you really like study Monk's music. And it took me years to figure that out, because I was just like, man, they're playing a bunch of wrong notes. And then I was like, actually, they're not. They're playing the tritone against whatever Monk is playing on the piano. He also, if you listen to Monk's bass players, he gave them a lot of room to experiment. So if you listen to Blue Monk, if you listen to Beshma Swing, if you listen to the song that I was going to reference to from that record, which is Evidence, you can hear Monk leaves a lot of space in his playing. He doesn't fill it up a lot with the piano. So really, it's the rhythm section, particularly the bass and the drummer, that are creating that tension. He's listening to what the bass player is doing. So Larry Gales is probably one of my favorite bass players that played with Monk. And Larry Gales' approach, he used a lot of fourths. And on bass, it's a very cool and unique sound, because he creates these tensions, these fourths that which on the upright bass, it kind of goes horizontal. So he's going across up and down the bass. And what he's doing is he's creating these tensions and release. So if you listen to Evidence has a multitude of chords in the A section that's moving. But if you listen to Larry Gale's bass line, he's playing a lot of tritones. So he's playing a root and a sharp 4, and he's moving it in fourths going across the bass, to where when once he resolves it, you can hear how Monk comes in and he'll play the chord or the stack on top of that. And it fits perfectly. That particular record, I studied a lot when I was in college because of the way Larry Gales played his bass lines. And one of the things too, another way how to create melodic bass lines is playing non-diatonic notes, which is why I use Evidence off of that record Live at the It Club as an example, because Larry Gales is playing a lot of non-diatonic notes. And what does that mean? That means if you're given a chord, you are playing the second, the fourth, or the fifth scale degree. I'm sorry, the second, the fourth, and the sixth scale degree outside of the triad that you're reading on bass. So if I'm looking at an F7, I can play a G, a B flat, or a D, which will be the second, fourth, and the sixth scale degree of that chord. And he uses that basis and moving it around in fourths. He uses that as a way to create tension, but diatonically, it resolves diatonically on the next wherever he's trying to release it. And he's one of the only few bass players that Monk performed with that I felt that really executed that well. Another bass player who is right up that same alley, but has a very much tonal approach, which would be Charles Mingus. Mingus, if you listen to Mingus's music, he has a heavily classical influence in his bass playing. Another bass player who is not on my list here, but is the very obvious choice would be Ron Carter, because Ron Carter started out on cello, and Ron Carter took those same classical etudes or those same classical repertoires, and he was able to manipulate that in his bass playing. But Mingus is the album that I refer to with Charles Mingus whenever I think of really great melodic bass playing is Money Jungle, Duke Ellington's Money Jungle, which has I think it's Duke, Max Roach, and Charles Mingus. And the song that I referenced that I learned in college was Caravan, Juan Tizol's Caravan. And the way Mingus plays on that record is not only hip, but you don't figure out where he is in the form until the last A section. So when Max is playing his solo at the beginning, he's kind of doing like a little intro, and then you hear Duke coming with the melody, very sparse, but that first chord, which would be a C7 flat 9, okay, he's superimposing like this D major like sound in the bass. It took me a long time to hear that because of the recording quality, but once I figured it out, I was like, man, he's not playing C7 flat 9 at all. he's actually superimposing a whole step up, but the notes that are in that scale are all upper extensions of that particular chord, and he knew that. And when you get to the bridge, when you get to that F7, when you get to that bridge, he does the same thing again. He superimposes G over F, but the notes that he's choosing all fit, and you don't hear it until they start walking, where in the middle of the head, they're walking at this point, or at least Max and him are walking. That's when you start to hear the flat 9. You start hearing him impose that C7 like sound. And that's really good bass playing, because what he's doing is he did two things on that recording. He figured out that Duke was playing a superimposed chord with the melody. He heard that, so he joined him in. And that's one thing that you can learn on a bandstand from piano players. If you want to really create a really cool bass line on the spot, listen to how the piano player is resolving their harmony, because a really good pianist would not always resolve harmonically on the root, like in terms of their chord choices. They won't do that a lot. And so it wasn't until maybe a minute and 31 seconds into the song that you hear Mingus actually starting to play the changes in the tune. That to me is probably one of the most significant ways of playing bass. Like that showcases that Mingus is using his ear, and he's very attuned to what's going on around him. So for those to the young players that are going to be watching this video later, please, one of the first records I have my students at FGCU learn is Money Jungle. I have them transcribe that record, because the way Mingus plays on it, it's so simple, but he's really not regurgitating back to the root motion a lot. And that's because he's just orally listening to what's going on around him. My next reference in terms of great melodic bass playing is Paul Chambers. So Paul Chambers to me signifies the bebop, the hard bop era of jazz. Like he's very, his two distinctive notions are chromaticism and triplets. If you listen to any Paul Chambers bass lines, he's very rhythmic. He's very rhythmic with his note choices, and he's very rhythmic with the way he lays it down, particularly in the triplet aspect. The most, I guess, sought out record that everybody would probably ever heard Paul Chambers play on was Kinda Blue. And the hookup between Jimmy Cobb and Paul Chambers on that album it's just ridiculous, because Paul liked to if you listen to So What, they're playing a Dorian, so they're playing a moto. So What is a moto tune, so they're only dealing with two chords, and the two chords are a half step apart from each other, okay, in terms of like the note heads between the D minor and the E flat. And the way Paul Chambers plays on there, the reason why it feels so good is because he's utilizing three different things all at once: blues, the Dorian scale, and the natural minor, because you hear him impose the flat 6, you hear him impose the major 6. Sometimes he'll play a harmonic minor-ish sound where he'll play that major 7th, but he uses it as a passing tone. And Paul Chambers was very known for his passing tone approaches. So to give you guys an example, real quick. Down here. Okay. You guys can still hear me? Still hear me? Okay. So Paul, playing from his bass line, he would start something like this. uses a lot of, it's really cold in my office, so my bass is a little shivery. He uses those chromatic notes not only as good passing tones, but he uses them as a way to create tension. And I love his bass lines because he uses a lot of diatonic notes, non-diatonic notes. Like you'll hear him imply the fourth scale degree, and he'll jump to the six. He might shoot up to the 9 and then walk chromatically back down. And he always resolves either on that root or the third in his bass lines, and they'll continue. He'll just keep going. That's what I learned about Paul Chambers and the way he walks bass lines. It's the way that he's able to shape his lines vertically going up, and he doesn't stop until he might resolve it back like at the very end of the tune. And that's something that I actually start off all of my bass students with Kinda Blue. That was the record that I started off with when I first learned how to play bass. But because the way Paul Chambers played was so simple, but yet it had a lot of potency to it. There was something there that you can gain a lot of information from. Now, my last example, this gentleman is rarely talked about in jazz. When I say rarely talked about, like, he had a short life. His life ended very early, but you know, this bass player got his first start with Teddy Wilson, piano player. And he started off as a very introverted bassist. It wasn't until he met Ahmad Jamal, and I'm referring to a gentleman named Israel Crosby. It wasn't until he met Ahmad Jamal where you started to hear a lot of very melodic lines. Like he would use a lot of sharp 11s. He would use these sharp 5s. You know, he learned all this because Ahmad Jamal's playing was very overtly into the chord. Like he would play within the key center, but he knew how to bring the melodic colors out of that. So the particular record that I was referred to for Israel Crosby, because I had never heard of him when I got to college. Before I went to college, I never knew who he was. My bass teacher says, "Brandon, I want you to listen to Cross Country Tour, 1958 to 61. I said, okay. And it's 2 discs. It's about 22 tracks on, I think, each one. They did a lot of music, and I'm pretty sure there was more than that. But those tracks that were on there were the arrangements, especially at Ponciana, Moonlight in Vermont, Cherokee, when they switched to 3. Like it's a lot of great arrangements. But the song "But Not For Me," if you listen to "But Not For Me," and this is the most transcribed, and I've asked a lot of famous bass players this, and I actually, I'd be curious to ask. I've never asked John Lamb this, if he would think this, but this is probably the most transcribed bass line that I think every bass player has known, and I have to play it for you because once you hear why I chose it, it's great. And I'm gonna play just a little bit of his bass line so you can hear what I'm referring to. Okay, so let's go here a little bit. Cool. So you have this something like that. It was the first. I had to play a little bit of that for you all because that was the first. He was the first bass player that I actually heard play upper extensions of a chord. So if you get to the first chord of that, you have a C13, and that bass line, he starts that whole bass line on the 13th and played the whole entire chord back down the scale. Like the way he was able to figure that out. When I started listening and studying a little more about the Ahmad Jamal trio, he would always tell Israel, I want you to play something that I probably would have not heard before. Let me tell you all something, how hard and difficult that is for a bass player to play something without having to repeat themselves again. Because on bass, you repeat a lot of the same lines, not intentionally, but because you're still trying to figure out how to get around the facility of the instrument and hearing things. But he would play a lot of color tones. So for instance, if I played the C major 7 sharp 11, if I played that F sharp, which is when that on his bass line, he actually does that. You hear him, instead of resolving it on the root, he plays the sharp 11 and creating these melodic songs. Basically, he told Israel, I want you to create bass lines like you're playing a melody. So one way to create a very melodic bass line is learn the melody of the song. So do 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 not for me. And he plays, if you break down that bass line, he's playing contents of the melody in his bass line. That's how he's able to get that sound out. And so for me, that's very important for young bass players to understand. When you want to learn how to play melodic bass lines, you got to learn the melody. And you should be able to play the melody on the bass so that when you are thinking about what to play, like for me, every time I learn a tune, I don't start off by learning bass lines. I learn the melody first. I make sure I can play the melody on the bass. And then once I'm able to play the melody, then I will start to dissect that melody into my bass lines. And what I'm doing is I'm actually teaching myself the form, because if I know the melody, I know the form. If I can walk the melody, I know the form because I'm playing the harmonics palette. So you're kind of doing like three things in one. So that would probably be one of my best approaches to learning how to do melodic bass lines, is learning the melody, playing very minimalistically, and then also listening. You have to listen a lot. You have to listen to a lot of great records. You know, you have to study that and understand how whatever that bass player is playing fits. Not everything is right, though. Paul Chambers played a lot of wrong notes. Mingus played some wrong notes, too. If you listen to some of those earlier Blue Note records, there's a lot of wrong notes on those records. However, these guys will go in and just do one take or two. You know, there weren't a lot of rehearsal space. And when you're recording on one reel and you have X amount of time to make that recording, you're forced to actually come out of the box and be creative like that. So I'll leave you all with this to say, on my Spotify playlist, when you are listening to the record, I want you to not listen to the bass player first. Listen to the other musicians around the bass player, because that bass player who's on that recording that's exactly what they're doing. They're listening to everything happening around them, and they're pulling all of that information and they're trying to tie it in to fit fundamentally into what they're doing. And once they figure that out, that's what actually starts to create what we call the conversation. A lot of young players have asked, what is the language? I don't get it. You have to listen to what's going on harmonically around you. There's sequences. There's certain attributes that each player is doing. That's why I say with Paul Chambers has a very distinct style of how he plays bass. So anybody you've ever heard him play with on recordings, even when he did that recording with Bill Evans, which I thought was like kind of left field from his Miles era, he plays the exact same. You can tell it's Paul Chambers playing bass. So one way to make your bass lines really stick out is you finding creative little licks that is your musical thumbprint. So when they hear that, they're like, oh, I know that's them. I know that that's who's playing bass. I can distinguish a Monk bass player from a bass players who play with Art Blakey. You know, like if I listen to Jimmy Merritt or Reggie Workman, they have a very distinct way of how they play bass with that group. Okay, so all these bass players that I've talked about today, they are not only melodic, but they're also rhythmically enhanced and in attune to what's going on around them. But they're gathering all of this information from the people that are surrounding them. So on that note, I didn't know if we had any questions or if anybody wants to chime in and has a question for me at all.
Thanks, Brandon, man. What a great session today. We'll see if anyone uses the chat feature, otherwise brings a question to our attention. And in the meantime, I just wanted to make a few announcements. We've got some really wonderful sessions coming up. You're going to be back with us on June 23rd, which is next week, for a topic that's really open to all instruments. It's called bass and drums, but it's really open to everyone. And the topic is tempos and styles, how to develop endurance during a performance. We also have with us back next week our good friends and education partners, Frank Williams and Tyler Wertman, on a trombone topic, scale pattern practice and alternate positions for trombone. And so we're really looking forward to those. John O'Leary's back with us next week too on how to develop rhythmic ideas to improvise better. But this week we still have some great sessions. John O'Leary is going to be following this session today at 4:30, how to develop a language for improvisation on piano. Dwayne White is with us tomorrow on trumpet, scales, using scales for ideas. And we have a guitar session tomorrow too with JJ Padishall, fundamentals of improvisation on guitar. So there's a lot of good stuff happening, and we hope people are enjoying these sessions. They're brought to you by the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation, which is the not-for-profit organization that produces the 40-year annual music festival and year-round education and outreach like this. We also thank our partners who help contribute to expanding the reach of this support, including the Al Downing Tampa Bay Jazz Association, the Pinellas Realtor Organization, and many others. Thanks for believing in Clearwater Jazz education and outreach. So Brandon, I don't see any other questions today. I'm going to turn it back to you maybe for a final thought to take us out, but we just really enjoy having you participate with us with these sessions, and we already are looking forward to the next one.
Thank you guys, and once again I want to send a big shout out and huge appreciative and blessings from the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation, from the Pinellas County groups that have been help sponsoring this as well. And Al Downing, I know they have such a huge impact in the Tampa Bay area. This is so important for our youth who are coming out of this area, for them to have this kind of exposure and free archive literature that they can go back at any time and look at. All the musicians that you named, Steve, are, not only close friends of mine, but they have everything to offer. They have so much to give and to share with our next generation coming up. So thank you guys again for letting me be a part of this. This is great. I actually enjoy doing this stuff, so it's fun for me.
That's awesome, man. Well, we'll be talking real soon. We'll see you back with us next week. And everybody, hope you can join us in about a half hour with John O'Leary. And if you can't, go to clearwaterjazz.com/education for all the upcoming sessions. Stay well, be safe, and keep playing.
Yes, keep playing. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much.